Welcome back to Radically Rethinking Railways, with you again in our 24th episode, and hosted, as always, by your mad professor, setting you right about the true problems and also achievements of our railways. If you have missed any of our previous episodes, check out the links below. We shine a light into so many topics, from the question of whether our railways don't have enough money in our episode 10, Money, 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 to the question of how much money they've been spending in our episode, Trillion is the New Billion. We keep ranging far and wide, from Switzerland to Colorado. In our most recent episode, Off the Gauge, we looked at whether the gauge really matters, both the problem of change of gauge and what is the best gauge. We can also shed light on specific railways, like we did in episode 15, Treasure Island, where we travelled within this country to Tasmania, where wonderful things have been done with the skinny gauge. And today, we will be going even skinnier, 610mm to be precise. Before we go any further, ponder what 610mm gauge is for the moment. Look around you for an object only 2 feet wide in the old language. Your computer monitor might be about that wide. Your chair might be if you're lucky enough. Now imagine tons of railway vehicle and its payload sitting up on rails, only that far apart, running faster than you can run, and maybe than you can ride a bike. Imagine, if you can, the New South Wales Government Railways 73 class diesel locomotive, 11 metres long, 4 metres high, and 2.8 metres wide, weighing 50 tonnes, and capable of 650 horsepower, sitting on wheel sets, only that wide. Several of the class were moved onto sugar railways, and ran well despite being so large on small tracks. People used to bigger trains than even that. Might imagine this skinny gauge is not useful for much, maybe a fairground ride, and they might disparage such trains, and we will get to that later in this episode. Yet some of Australia's most successful, most extensive, and some of our most loved rail networks have run on this, in service of the sugar industry. So today we are flying to Central Queensland to look at some of them, and look at what is unique. The sugar region covers from near Grafton in the Bundaberg lands of New South Wales, right up past Mossman on the Cookie-Yallinji country in Queensland, though unfortunately sugar railways are no longer found in New South Wales, nor anywhere in Queensland south of where we are now, in Isis in the Kabi lands. Sugar was grown in formal districts around Grafton, around Murwillumbah, north of the Gold Coast, through the Sunshine Coast, and is still grown near Maryborough, but these days, none use rail. As districts urbanise and sugar lands become fragmented, it can harm rail, and we will talk more about that in this episode. What we are really talking about is an industrial railway, and the adjective industrial can have several connotations. The first is that the rail system belongs to the industry. That is certainly true. The second is that the rail system is formally part of the industrial process, not merely the conveyance of input to that process, or the transport of the output, but at the heart of the industrial system that turns cane in the fields into sugar crystals in your coffee. A final connotation is that the rail system is exclusive to the sugar industry. In other words, you can't use it for passengers or general freight. While that is true now, it wasn't always. And all the surviving lines are on the 610mm gauge, though some, like the former Maryborough system, were on the Cape gauge that we saw so effectively used in our last episode. Let's first get out of the way the names. Back in episode 6, we travelled back to ancient China and ancient Greece to ask those wise men like Confucius, Lao-Tzu, and Plato all about the names of things. Confucius thought that having the right names was important, because the administrative state would collapse without them. Plato thought we could get into the very essence of perfection if we got the names right, while Lao-Tzu thought that would be fruitless. And in our world are the silly words tram and light rail. As we saw in that episode, sometimes these words are used to demean a rail system. Other times they are used by tricky administrators to try and avoid a law, and chances are the administrators themselves drafted that law. So it begs the question, why they won't just change the law to avoid the problem, rather than giving things funny names. In Victoria, the Port Melbourne and St Kilda railways had vast amounts of money spent on them by by a hopeless Labor government in the 1980s to achieve not very much. They hoped by changing the voltage of the overhead wire and moving the rail in slightly, they could trick other administrators into believing the railway was now a tramway or light railway, and by so doing, employ less staff and obey fewer rules. In New South Wales, we had the fictitious Silverton Tramway, a railway company built to mainline rail standards on the Cape Gauge. This ludicrous ruse was to fool the rule makers about the true nature of the line, a South Australian Railways line, within the borders of New South Wales. It carried South Australian trains, with mining, general goods and passengers, in every respect, the same between Broken Hill and the New South Wales border as it did through South Australia to Port Pirie. We even have the Yass and Camden tramways. Nonsense ideas. These were ordinary New South Wales government railways, but enabled to bypass staffing requirements by calling them trams. We saw that the word tram probably stemmed from light mining trackage, used to carry underground mining skips by hand or horse, and later moved into both industrial railways and street railways, where the emphasis was not on how poorly built they were, but how they could use informal rules, less formal safe working, and lower crewing. The sugar systems started like the underground mining trackage, very light systems, for moving wagons by hand or horse. Many had and still have less formal rules than the mainline system. However, in a world where all industries have to have formal safety systems, sugar railways are no less rule-driven than a mainline system. So the word tram no longer has any useful meaning for these lines. As for the word light rail, well yes, this is probably a better use of the term than for the street passenger railways, or segregated passenger railways that use such vehicles. The sugar railways, because of their gauge and their informality, have long pioneered such things as temporary sidings, able to be lifted into place for a season and later removed. Point work that might also be temporary. Seasonality is such an important driver of the operation of sugar systems. The cane spends 6 months of the year growing. Then over a 6-month period, generally May to December, it is cut and quickly shipped by train to the mill, which is at the heart of each system. The other 6 months, historically called the slack, but more formally a non-operational period, is perfect for track maintenance. If you do see rail vehicles on the system during those months, it will be for maintenance. As we said earlier, the mill is at the heart of the rail system, but also the rail transport process is in the middle of a single long industrial process. Hence the rail system and the mill are a machine ensemble. Cut cane has certain characteristics, such as needing to be processed quickly, but also at a steady rate, and not being particularly economic to transport over long distances or small batches, hence the continued use of the rail systems, where some other industries would now use road. Australian sugar has to compete with much cheaper countries overseas. Sugar is a subtropical or tropical crop, and sadly most tropical countries that grow sugar are relatively poor, with cheap labour, low safety standards, and without the institutional capability to enforce standards or charge motor vehicles for road damage. Hence the terrible images you see of overloaded trucks in India, or poor people selling individual stalks or bunches of stalks in a market. Nobody in Australia could make a living wage from selling such small quantities of sugar. Australians expect their own sugar to be processed and sold in supermarkets. Fiji used to have an extensive and very scenic set of sugar rail networks on both main islands, and the Singatoka lines would have been amazing. However, your mad professor never got to see this beautiful system. Some lines around Nandi are still in use, so try and see them, before sadly they may all be gone. The need for efficiency in sugarcane handling can both help and hinder the use of rail in Australia. Because of consolidation of many mills in Australia, some sugar networks have become very long, and include very long sections of track that are regarded as main lines, not serving adjacent farms or sidings. Between Proserpine and Mackay, for example, a section of line 50 kilometres long that doesn't serve immediately adjacent farms. Thus, closing mills only serves to make the remaining rail system more important. The Mackay system also re-gauged the old QR line to Finchhatton and runs sugar trains on this line to a length of 70 kilometres. But as we noted, fragmentation of sugarcane land that was previously contiguous for other crops or for urban growth, or opening up new sugarcane land far from the mill, can mean that more and more sugar moves by road, until, as we saw sadly in places like the Gold Coast Rocky Point, or Maryborough, or Nambour, the rail systems are no more. Sugar is harder to grow further south, so we see the main sugar belts from Sarina to Innisfail really investing in rail development, but harder to find elsewhere. And as market gardens are lost from around the immediate vicinity of our state capitals, we can probably expect other high value crops, such as vegetables, avocados, macadamias, displacing sugar from its land. We said sugar railways are possibly the best candidate for the term light rail, yet how light are they? The 73 class we described before is hardly light at 50 tonnes. Some sugar railways run trains of 1500 tonnes and 1 kilometre in length. A train of 1500 tonnes and 1 kilometre in length would be a heavier and longer train than the Victorian or Tasmanian railways would have run on many of their lines for much of the history of those systems. And let's compare network length. The Mackay system alone is the same length at 850 kilometres as the Tasmanian Government Railway system at its height. The Wilmar systems between Proserpine and Innisfail have 1600 kilometres of track. This is just shy of the total length of all passenger railways in Victoria. Like the Queensland coal railways we saw in our episode 14, Our Finest Hour, some sugar lines have implemented mid-train locomotives to provide increased length. Rails of the size used on the mainline system, concrete sleepers and heavy bridges have all been put in over recent decades. Wagons have gone from laying stalks flat on open wagons, like this Fijian one, to massive bogie bins on some lines, with the ideal compromise being between capacity and strength on one hand, and lightness of construction on the other. Finally, we should mention while practically all payload for sugar railways these days is cut cane, processed sugar is also carried on cane railways to the port of Lucinda on the land of the Biagiri, where sugar is conveyed in bulk down the 6 kilometre long jetty to waiting ships. So we can be impressed by both the scale and progress of our sugar railways, holding their own against some of the modest operations of our government systems. But what of our other industries? Forestry was an important user of rail systems. However, per tonne of product, namely a single log on a pair of temporary bogies, these systems were very inefficient. And forestry was originally set up to be unsustainable, with forests cleared of trees. Then the caravan moved on to other forests, thinking that this went on forever. In other respects, forestry railways had a lot in common with sugar railways, but not that self-destructive instinct. Ad hoc and informal systems were found up and down Australia, most extensively in the mountains of Victoria, the north coast of New South Wales, and in pockets of Tasmania. And yet these were often of the 610mm gauge, like the sugar, or other small gauges. This Taiwanese footage from Ali Shan, by friend of the channel Yuan Jiao, will give you a very good sense of logging trains worked by Shay locomotives, and a sister of this locomotive is found at Menzies Creek on the Belgrave-Gembrook line. But much more formal systems existed, including huge networks controlled by major timber producers, including the one by the company we now know as Bunnings in Pemberton. These lines were Cape gauge and used locomotives that were generally left over from government service decades earlier, and were a great reason so many classic 19th century locomotives survived into preservation. Sadly, the government line into the southwest has closed, but a section at Pemberton is open for tourists. This will give you a sense of what such lines were like up until the early 1970s. But the forestry industry, with its unsustainable practices, cut its own throat, and with it the rail lines they depended on. Mining, particularly coal, produced huge lengths of industrial rail network. We need to distinguish between the light lines for use inside the mines, often of the 610mm gauge, from lines for taking coal to the customer or the port. Those lines would usually be government gauge, most notably around Mullumbimba or Newcastle on Awabakal land. We had the Richmond Vale and South Maitland systems, and these systems survived to recent decades. and one notable feature these lines shared with the sugar railways was the wagon pools. In essence, the private investors, or their banks, were taking the ownership cost of the rolling stock, and if you needed 200 wagons for your small mine, you could go and buy them. Because these coal systems almost always fell short of the export port and required government transport for the last section of the journey, they were invariably in need of locomotive exchange, as the government did not generally want those private locomotives on their track, though there were exceptions to that too, like in Wollongong. And as we round out our discussion of the sugar railways, we can see some general principles that the government railways failed to use to their cost, and the major crop they carried, which is wheat and other grains. Most of the state systems had a wheat traffic that depended on the broad acres of wheat in the dry and semi-arid lands of each state, and in these areas we saw large mini-networks of lines that served that market, such as the mini-network northwest of Temora on the Wiradjuri lands of New South Wales, or the vast spread of lines in Victoria's northwest or southwestern Queensland. These mini-networks still largely survive, though closures have been very heavy. They are also at risk from climate change, as it is not known if the combination of drier climate, salty soils, and soil destruction might see the end of this industry. Unlike sugar, government railways have served this industry very poorly. Wheat and sugar, of course, have some differences as crops. Wheat comes in grains and is high density. You can grow 10 tonnes of wheat in a hectare, and while you could grow 70 tonnes of sugar cane in the same hectare, little of that is actual sugar. So the sugar cane rail process is essentially about moving small amounts of the actual product, and much more of the waste product, while the wheat waste stays generally on the farm. By building the wheat lines as general purpose rail lines for general goods and passengers as well as wheat, the lines have been, in most cases, over-engineered. Wheat, like sugar, is seasonal, and in the old days the lines were used all year for passengers and general goods, but now may only see trains during harvest. But the problem is, unlike sugar, the government never developed the rhythm of intensive use, followed by seasonal closure and maintenance. In episode 23 about rail gauges, we concluded the Cape gauge would have been the best Australian gauge, and given it can be used for 210 km/h trains, or trains of 10,000 tonnes, it is a practical mainline gauge, but as we saw with sugar, it could also be lightly and easily laid into the fields and farms, and could have done the same for wheat as it did for sugar, and just as easily served the 19th century farmer with his hand cart or horse trolley as it would today with 10,000 horsepower of Progress Rail diesel up the front and 100-tonne wagons. In wheat territory, that would have given us the possibility of a farmer with his tractor or light shunter moving a few wagons along a temporary siding to a major line, where maybe there were temporary points or only a short length of siding, and all that could be left fallow during the off-season. Wagon pools, like coal or sugar, should not have been the property of government railways. All that capital asset on the railway books that didn't need to be there. Those wagons could instead have been owned by the shippers, the farmers, or even the customers of the wheat. We used to have government marketing boards for wheats and grains who could have done all this, but equally, local councils who didn't want the cost of road maintenance could have overseen these mini-networks and staffed them far less extensively than the government. They could have avoided the ridiculous overmanning that was caused by elaborate safe working systems or running passenger trains, and all the other reasons these networks were inefficient. The sad situation, because we didn't go down the sugar route, is inefficient wheat operations led to line closures and wheat being moved by road, all for the want of scalability, the common sense, and the integrated industrial structure of sugar. And this was the fault of the bureaucrats we saw in our episode 13. Those were the days, my friends. These bureaucrats wanted to expand their railway empires, the ones who refused to fight the unions in plain language, but as we saw, thought that renaming railways might produce a different outcome, the ones who refused to improve productivity when we started to see the need for them to do that, way back in the 1920s. They have let the wheat networks fall apart, and then blame the road lobby for their crimes, which was something we discussed In our 8th episode, who blamed Roger Rabbit? It wasn't the road lobby who killed wheat transport. There are multitudinous problems with road haulage of wheat, including drivers having to work long shifts from inland farms to the ports, where they might sit for hours in their truck, waiting to unload. Sugar teaches us that a stable industrial process, with wagons able to sit in sidings, awaiting loading, while the loco and its crew can move on, is far more efficient. But if road is able to capture wheat traffic from rail, then rail must be doing something very wrong indeed. Next time on Radically Rethinking Railways. So many false narratives in Australian rail are based on the Depression and the war. We go back in our time machine to see for ourselves how wrong these stories are and what really happened to our railways. Next time in When the War is Over. See you then.